Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that we're able to sneak this class in today. We'll see if tonight we're able to even meet, but I'm glad to have you all here as we're beginning the Passion. I've jumped ahead just a little bit to get to the actual story of the Passion, and there's quite a bit that is covered just in this chapter, although we've got to get through chapter 27 also in the next few weeks if we want to follow kind of a schedule, although it'd be okay if we didn't. But today we're just in the first three parts of this outline. The plot to kill, really murder. I'll talk about the word apoktainai. And then Jesus' anointing. And curiosity there is, that's my text for Ash Wednesday tomorrow. Or the same story. It's from John's Gospel, but it's the same account that I'm doing tomorrow for the beginning of Lent. And then the beginning of the betrayal at verse 16. I don't think we're going to get any farther than that today. But then next time we'll cover the Lord's Supper. We might stay in the Lord's Supper all of next Tuesday, and then move on to the last 5 points on the week after that, and then get into chapter 27, the trial and the end of the trial and the crucifixion then after that. But that's kind of where we're headed. So just beginning chapter 26. If you all have a copy, I do have a handout this time. Was it last time I forgot to set one out? We had blank paper. Apologize for that. But we'll begin here at the beginning of chapter 26. So this is the plot. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, and that's what we just skipped, basically all of chapters 24 and 25 about the end times and so forth, then he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days it will be the Passover, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." And we have here a chronology question, because in the next story, John tells us that it's 6 days before the Passover. But this one is 2 days before the Passover. So do we have a problem? Well, not really. Matthew is a storyteller. John is a storyteller. Sometimes when I'm telling a story, I introduce a topic, even though chronologically it goes before or after something else. And is that really a problem necessarily? I don't think so at all. But what we do know is that this little incident, verses 1 to 5, was 2 days before the Passover, which puts us at, let's see, in Hebrew chronology you count the day itself. So this would be along about Wednesday of Holy Week, which matches with what we know about the betrayal and so forth. But so Jesus is talking about this, and now prophesies more than the type of death he's going to have, because he's done that many times with many details about the betrayal and the whipping and the crucifixion and so forth. But now he goes not only to the type of death, but the very day of his death. So Jesus includes that as well. So after 2 days it'll be Passover, the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Then the chief priests and elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. And now I'm going to get to some of these pictures before we go down to the list of high priests. A couple of you asked questions before class, and I want to cover those here. But let's take a look at just this. This is based on archaeology and some drawings. This is a model. I don't know what scale the model is, but it's quite large. It's in Jerusalem, and it's outdoors. And it's a model of what Jerusalem looked at the time of Christ. And that would be, this before you is the palace of Caiaphas. You see in the middle, there looks like, you see like the three little houses up there toward the top of the palace, like the three little pigs. And then in front of that is what looks to me like a reverse house. Like somebody took a house or something and flipped the roof upside down or whatever, and you're wondering why that would be. Well, why would that be? It's a very good reason why you'd want your roof the opposite of the way we do roofs in Minnesota. They didn't want to keep the rain out. They wanted to gather the rain, the little rain they had. And so it's actually an open courtyard, very common for lighting purposes in Palestine, all through the Levant, the east, into Greece, Syria, and so forth, where in ancient times there would often be an open courtyard. This has several open courtyards, actually. If we get closer here, you can kind of see how then you are kind of able to walk, though, also from roof to roof, and you can have people up above. Very interesting design for a house. Something that would be a nightmare with snow, right? But very, very curious way of designing a home in their time. Today, there is a medieval Byzantine Christian church over the site of Caiaphas's house, or over the site of most of it there. But that's what this thing is. But some of it has been reconstructed as it was in those days. And this is a photograph of the reconstruction of the courtyard. And you can see here how Jesus might be passing through the pillars, through the gallery from one part of the house to the other when Peter saw him and Jesus looked at him and Peter wept bitterly and so forth. So, good illustration of that. Now, let's start with Diane. You had a question about the high priest.
Yeah, why are there so many in such a short period of time?
Because the Romans got their fingers into the leadership of Judea. So a high priest was supposed to be the successor of his father. That's the way it had been in the early times. So the list of high priests from Aaron to this guy, Joazar ben Buthus, 4 BC, the Bethian group was connected somehow to the Sadducees. And so this guy is Sadducee. But from Aaron to him, it's not that long of a list of names because it's father to son, father to son, father to son. How many high priests might there be in 100 years? No, not at this rate. In the other way, father to son. 4 or 5 maybe, something like that in 100 years. So it's 1,500 years from Aaron to this period, or calculated a little bit differently, it's about 700 years from Aaron to or is it more than that? Aaron to the Babylonian captivity. I guess 1,000 years from Aaron to Babylon. And then about 500 years from Babylon to this time period. There's a couple lists. There's a break in the high priesthood over the captivity. And then you get to this time period where things are just a mess. After the Romans took over in the Maccabean revolt, things were kind of partially restored. The Maccabees, in fact, the family of the Maccabees, a real historical family, and the part of the apocryphal books are written about them, but they were a priestly family in the line of the priesthood and restored the high priesthood with their own family members. So those guys are in the line in the 100s BC. And then this kind of happens when the Romans get their fingers into it. The Romans are often replacing guys after only 2, 3, maybe 5 years at a time. If somebody did something the Romans didn't like, send a letter off to Caesar and now replace him with somebody else. So you have a bunch of living former high priests, potentially. So.
But there was only one high priest at a time.
One guy was serving as high priest, yeah. But Caiaphas, we see in the Bible, defers to his father-in-law, Annas. Do you see the two of them are yeah. So Annas, his father-in-law, is from 6 to 15 as high priest. He's about in the middle of the list there. I think he's called Ananus on your handout. But he's Annas in the Bible. And then a couple guys later, just 3 years later, Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas, is the son-in-law of Annas. And now he's high priest. And so these other guys, you had an Ishmael who is going to come back and be high priest again down the road, a little bit like a president with two different non-successive terms or something. And then Eliezer, son of Annas, and Simon is for less than a year there, Simon ben Camathus. And then you've got Caiaphas, Joseph ben Caiaphas, he's just called Caiaphas though, who's a high priest for quite a long time, 18 to 36. Isn't that about 18 years? So something like that. So that's why that is. The Romans didn't like him, he was out, and another guy was brought back in. The guys are generally in line to be high priest in some way, but the Romans were really paid fast and loose with that because they wanted a high priest who would be in line with Roman desires and things like that. And then, Larry, did you have a question also? Before class? I told you to wait and ask it during class?
Oh, just why I think you answered.
Oh, the same thing? Okay, yeah. Yeah, so that's basically it. The list, by the way, of high priest ends at the year 70. So with the destruction of the temple. The last high priest is put to death by the Romans, and there is no line, there is no succession of high priests since then. However, I know of living Jewish men who are from the family of Levi who can trace their genealogy back into the priesthood. In fact, I met one man who was a janitor of the church where I vicared, who was a Jew, Kohathite Jew, who could trace his ancestry back to Adam and Eve. And he had them all in spiral-bound notebooks. He was, technically he was, I think you would call him my first conversion. The first guy I converted to become Lutheran. But he became our church janitor after that. But it was Rabbi Warren Cohen was his name. Nice guy. All right, so we have this going on in the courtyard in the house of the high priest, and they plotted how to arrest Jesus by stealth and to kill him. The Greek word here, apoktaino, means to murder somebody. They aren't even pretending anymore that they just want to trick him, and get him to maybe reveal that he's a false teacher of some kind. Nobody can trick him. He's answered every single question, and now they just want to catch him and kill him. And the one exception is that they said is that Caiaphas insists not during the festival, or else there might be a riot among the people. What an irony we have there. The high priest wants to murder Jesus, but not during the feast. Jesus, who is our true high priest, knows he must be put to death during the feast. And which one of them is going to win? Jesus, of course. Just an amazing contrast between them. That Jesus would suffer and die during the Passover and do it for all mankind. And by the way, this riot that they were afraid of never happened. Even though it did happen the way they feared it would, there was no riot about Jesus. They had all the guards there and everything to make sure that it didn't happen. There was more of a riot when they almost let him go, wasn't there? All that business about give us Barabbas and all of that. Yeah. So the three festivals, by the way, we should just identify this one. So there are three of them mentioned in Exodus. The first one is Passover, which happens in spring. In fact, it is, if it's easiest to remember it this way, then remember it this way. It is the day of the first full moon of spring. It's approximate that way, and you might be exactly a month off some years. But if I can condense it for you, because the months in the Hebrew calendar always begin with a new moon. That is the dark moon, the black moon, okay, which always is setting at sunrise. That's why there's no crescent to see at that time. That's a new moon. And all of the Jewish months, they had a lunar calendar, and they began, that's what the word month means, in fact, is a month. And so this was always the 15th or the 14th of Nisan, so 2 weeks into the month where you get a full moon. Okay? So a couple days after a new moon, it begins to wax as a crescent. On the right side is where the bright stuff is on a waxing moon. And then the first quarter, it's where it's half. That's a week after the new moon. And then it's waxing, it's called gibbous when it's mostly full. And then the day that it's full, we just call it the full moon. And then it begins to wane when the right side of the moon becomes darker as it's getting less and less. Waning gibbous last quarter. Finally, the crescent whittles its way down to new moon again. And the Jews celebrated a new moon with a festival. There was a party that night every full moon. Every new moon, I should say. Why would you want to have a gathering with family and friends when there's a new moon?
Light.
Say that again?
There's light.
No, there's not. And I think that's the point. When there's a new moon, do you want your daughter out, walking from A to B when there's no light of the moon at all or anything like that? So let's keep all of our young'uns in, and we'll have a big old party at home. Something like that. But that's one idea that has been raised for why would the Lord command those festivals? They're not really commanded, but they did them, And then everybody is more in tune with the calendar. Half the time, I don't even know what day it is of the month. If I'm writing a check, do you have that problem? Do you got to look at the calendar before you write a check? This year I did pretty well with the year number. But it's getting now that I can't type 2023 without blowing the first half of it. It's like, what is it? 21, 23, 23, 23? I don't know what year it is. But the 23 at the end I get, but the rest of it is a muddle to me. So anyway, that's the things. And now you see that the very first month of the year was when Passover happened, celebrating the Exodus from Egypt. And then a couple months later was the first harvest festival, Pentecost. The rains had to green up whatever you had planted. And they have a different climate than ours, so we think it's just strange to already be harvesting in maybe May or June, but that's what they did to harvest the early stuff. And then 6 months after that, they're harvesting the last of the stuff that comes at the Feast of Ingathering, or booths, or tabernacles, which is another celebration of their life after Egypt when they were living in little huts or tents in the 40 years in the wilderness. The tabernacles really celebrates that. The tabernacles are their tents, not the temple, but their ordinary tents that they lived in those times. Today, tabernacles is celebrated by Jews by actually camping out in a kind of a hut or a tabernacle. You can look it up online. There are some pretty extravagant ones, and there are some pretty simple ones. And I really have no idea how strict they are about staying in the tent, but that's where you slept and ate your meals. But as far as the rest of it goes, you would probably go and do your work otherwise. Okay. Anything that far? So we have a plot now that's forming, but now we get to Jesus in Bethany. So when Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, and evidently this happens a few days prior to what we just read, because it seems to me that this meal at Simon the leper's house is probably on Sunday or maybe Monday, either Palm Sunday or the next day, or something like that. But Jesus came from Bethany into Jerusalem, and he went back out again. And this is one of those back out at Bethany moments. I have a little chart here. I think I put this on the second page of your notes. Is that right? Or did I forget? There's no chart? I meant to give you this. I'm sorry. Well, okay. Well, it's on the screen. So there are some people in ancient times thought that there were 3 anointings of Jesus. I'm convinced that there are simply 2, but it's Luke who tells us the odd one out. So if I can read down the middle column first, this is from Luke chapter 7. It's early in Jesus' ministry. It's in the home of a man named Simon the Pharisee. And there a sinful woman from the town comes and anoints his feet and uses her tears and hair to anoint Jesus' feet. And she's broken an alabaster jar. The perfume there is mentioned as worth 500 denarii. And the price is really only in the accompanying parable, but it's there. And the host, Simon, complains about this. But it's primarily that it's from early in Jesus' ministry, that the woman is a sinful woman, and that the guy's name is Simon the Pharisee. Simon was a common name because of the tribe of Simeon. Tribe of Simeon was within the boundaries of the tribe of Judah. In ancient times, there are a lot of Simeons around in the Bible. One of the most common names, Simon or Simeon. If you look at Matthew and Mark in the left column, it clearly happens not early in the ministry, but during Holy Week, just before Holy Week. It's in the home of a guy named Simon the leper. Different Simon, probably, and Jesus cleansed a lot of lepers. This is clearly a guy Jesus had healed, and now the guy's throwing a party for Jesus to thank him for what he had done. Wouldn't you expect, isn't that a typically Midwestern thing? Anytime you're in town, Jesus, you come here and I'll feed you. Something like that, or whatever it would be. So that's what happens at Bethany as well. Now a woman in Matthew and Mark, an unnamed woman, comes and anoints him on the head, also from an alabaster jar. Alabaster, there are 2 definitions of alabaster. One is the beautifully, translucent, usually white or striped gray and white or brown and white. Jade-like stone that has been formed and shaped. And it's sometimes possible to use a stopper with it, but if it's perfume, you probably just have to break the neck and pour. Because if you use a stopper in the kind of jars they used, you only get a little drop at a time. It's that kind of a top where it would be very difficult to get out, say, 2 whole cups of fluid. It would take forever. You have to break the neck and then pour the whole thing out. And all the disciples complain. In John's Gospel, which is what I'm preaching on tomorrow, it happens just before Holy Week again, and the house is not mentioned, but some of the guests are mentioned. So there you've got Lazarus, who is a guest in the home, and Mary and Martha are there, and they're both serving in different ways. So I know some people are kind of confused and they think that this is Mary and Martha's house, and that Martha once again is serving, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like that's the house of Simon the leper, and that Martha is simply taking the position that a woman might take because a man could have his own wife or daughter serve him if he's eating at somebody else's house. That was an honor they could claim. No, my guy, my dad or whatever, I'm going to serve him. Well, Jesus does not have a wife or daughters, but Martha, his dear friend, just had her brother raised from the dead by Jesus. That's Lazarus, the other guest of honor. And now Martha wants to serve and could be permitted to serve. But ancient sources are pretty clear about that could happen, that somebody could come in and serve a guy at somebody else's house. And notice that in this case, Martha does not complain. Like in the earlier gospel text in Luke, where Martha is griping about Mary not helping out, Martha has sort of learned her lesson. She's happy to serve. So that's fine. Now the stuff is defined as pure nard or spikenard, which is a perfume that comes from the Himalayan mountains. So it's from way over in the east. It's the western side of the Himalayas. are the countries we call Nepal today and Kashmir. This was a plant that grew on the slopes or in the valleys below these magnificent mountains. And it wasn't the flowers, but rather the stem and the root that would be dried and crushed and would produce this amazing smell. I haven't finished tomorrow's sermon yet, but I'm going to describe it as being kind of an earthy, sweet, woody smell, and a little bit musty to some people as well. But in this oily substance, and you know how much 2 cups is, right? You know, that's a pint. And that's how much she pours out to use. So evidently on here in Matthew, on his head, and in John also on his feet. But there's a bunch of runoff. And so what does she do? She uses her hair to catch it. Can you imagine what her hair smelled like for the next week? You know? So that would have been something. I kind of wonder if Mary, if she got involved also as one of the women at the tomb, and her hair still smelled like the nard, and they're already burying him. Just a curiosity there, just a thought I've had about that. The cost of this stuff is given as maybe 300 denarii. That's in Mark, I think, rather than the 500 in Luke. And here only Judas complains. But I want to go down a couple things. So I've mentioned that there's a chronology question here. 6 days before the crucifixion, or the Passover rather. We don't know the home in John, but we do in Matthew, Mark. It's the home of Simon the leper. The woman's name is Mary, and Mary of Bethany was not a sinful woman. Some people think it was Mary Magdalene in Luke, but Luke doesn't say that. He just says a sinful woman, but not Mary of Bethany. That's Martha's sister that we're talking about here. And then Matthew and Mark mention that the disciples complained. John, only that Judas complained. I kind of wonder if Matthew is kind of saying, Judas might have said it, but I guess in the back of my mind I was agreeing with him. It was kind of a waste, that kind of thing. Would you expect that maybe of Matthew, to be a little bit confessional here? I'm not surprised by that at all. So, okay. So this woman approached him holding an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. Oh, I didn't finish my comment about alabaster. So it could be this alabaster, as we know it today, but some people think that it also could have been simply carved from marble, which would have looked like alabaster and behaved. Marble is a fairly easy stone to carve. It's quite soft, and you could carve a jar out of it as well. Not exactly the same, though, and I don't think there's reason to really debate about it. It doesn't make any difference in the end, you know. I haven't heard anybody really complaining about what product their shampoo bottle is made out of ever since Prell gave up the glass bottle for the plastic bottle. Do you remember the TV commercial where the dad at the bottom of the stairs says, "Oh, I need some shampoo," and the mom at the top of the stairs says, "Here, catch." And it's, because we all know that shampoo came in glass bottles, and now it's like, "Here, catch," and it bounces on the couch and it doesn't break, and because now it comes in plastic bottles. And so, well, apparently 1969 was a big year. So, am I the only one who remembers old TV commercials? I don't know. Do you remember that?
Different ones, we're older than you.
Okay. Oh, sure. Some of you. So, she poured out on his head as he was reclining at the table. This word reclining is typical of dining in those days. Have I demonstrated this for you often enough that I don't have to do it again now? But if you can, I don't have a picture of it in the slides, I'm sorry, but if you can imagine, let's just say Cleopatra on one of those long couches with no backs, but with a curly thing on the ends, you know, and with a throw pillow or whatever. And then they thought that in their culture that leaning on your left arm, but being spread out, reclining horizontally, was good for your digestion. You know, Or at least they hadn't thought through it. They didn't want to change. In our culture, we tend to think that driving 70 miles an hour down the highway with a sandwich in my hand is good for my digestion, or at least that's how we eat today. Yes?
The doctors or whatever will tell you that if you have indigestion when you're at night, you should lie on your left side.
They didn't do it for medical reasons. They did it because they were biased against left-handedness. Do you all know the Latin word for left-handed? Sinister. That's what the word means. My left-handed brother got the nickname Dexter, which means right-handed. But my brother is left-handed. But we call him Dexter. But he's left-handed.
That's like being called tiny when you weigh 500 pounds.
Something like that, yeah. Don't give people ideas when I'm sitting up here on the chair. All right. So he's reclining at the table. She pours it on his head, and then she evidently goes down to the other end and pours it on his feet as well. Very humbling act to wash somebody's feet. Have any of you ever washed the feet of an adult? Have you? Can I ask when?
Well, working at the nursing home.
Oh, working in the nursing home. Alan?
My mother was in her later years.
Okay. Taking care. I did it in the basement of the church immediately after my wedding. I made Kath go downstairs. Everybody's waiting for us upstairs. I made her come down the steps with me. We were alone. I had a pan of warm water and a towel. Made her take off her shoes and hike up her dress, and I washed her feet. But I wanted our marriage to start off exactly that way. She was not happy with me. But I did it. She let me do it, but she wasn't happy. And everybody wondered, what were you guys doing? And they didn't have to know, but that's what we were doing. I was washing her feet. And by the way, a pint, again, 2 cups. That's a lot of... Imagine... most of us have at least one container probably at home of liquid hand soap. Is that 1 cup in those bottles, or maybe 2? Imagine pouring all of that out, though. Yikes. And the thing that she doesn't do is she doesn't go and ask Simon for a couple of towels. What does she do? She uses her own hair. Instead, she takes care of it herself. But then, now the sinfulness starts in. The disciples get mad. Why this waste? Matthew, in his text, does not single out Judas yet. That's later in the chapter, actually. But I kind of wondered, did Matthew think? Yeah, I kind of joined in. So he just says disciples rather than Judas. But John says Judas. This is also the story where John tells us Judas was 2 things. He was the treasurer. That's where we learn that, is in this account in John. And he was a thief. Yeah, John comes out and tells us in John 12 those 2 things in this moment. And their complaint goes on. This perfume could have been sold for a lot of money and given to the poor. Though, other times, Mary and Joseph didn't say that when the wise men brought gifts to baby Jesus, did they? Oh, no, you could sell that and give it to the poor. That was fine. Nobody came and said this when Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were preparing Jesus' body for burial. Nobody came and scolded them. You could be using that for something else. I'm guessing that the last time you got a Christmas present, you did not say, oh, no, you could have sold this gift and given it to the poor, or something like that. What kind of mind says that when a gift is being given, and an extravagant, amazing gift is being given? Jesus was aware of this and said to them, why are you causing trouble for this woman? Obviously she's planned this, right? She saved, she spent. What a gift. That's a year's wages. A day's wage is about a denarius. This thing, 300 denarii, about a year's wages. So what is that for the average guy working today? Is it $50,000? That's a pretty nice bottle of perfume, isn't it? And she pours it out right here in this one act. And Jesus says, she has done a beautiful thing for me. What does beautiful mean?
Loving,
Could be loving.
lovely.
Lovely in the sense of pleasing to the senses or pleasing to the mind. Yeah. Also, beautiful can be of a very high standard. She answered him in beautiful Latin. That's a very high standard, a quality of something. Here, I think pleasing to the mind, the senses, the heart, more of what you guys said than what I said is what we're talking about here, but a beautiful thing for me. You try to come up with your own adjective here of what she did, and we would say stuff probably like what? Overwhelming, amazing, extravagant. Jesus says beautiful. There's a lot of meaning packed into that word beautiful here. That's just striking, very striking choice of words. And Jesus continues, you are always going to have the poor with you, but you are not always going to have me. So Jesus also points out this was appropriate. Also, this act, Jesus points out, is unique. This is because I'm still with you. This is this kind of an act, not some other kind of an act. And when she poured the perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. So it's going to be quick when the burial comes. In fact, do the women ever actually get to Jesus to anoint his body for burial? No, it's just the two guys, right? It's just Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus who come and have a little bit of something that they wrap. And what they do is they're not really putting anything on his body. They're putting bits of frankincense or myrrh or something in the wrappings as they're wrapping. That's how they did that, rather than really even come into contact with the body. Today, when a person dies, their body is washed, and very, very carefully and very respectfully washed. Did you know that if you wanted to, the funeral home would allow you to come in and wash your own loved one's body? They certainly allow that. There is sometimes a time issue, so you're going to be grieving and everything, but you can go and do that if you would prefer to do it. And then dress the body depending on if it's going to be embalmed or cremated. Two different choices there, and what's going to happen, but that's possible. But Mary is the one who really gets to prepare his body for burial at a time when it's going to be appreciated. And then Jesus finishes here by saying, amen, I tell you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told in memory of her. So this gospel, in this case, is all four gospels. And do we retell the story of Mary over and over and over again? Yeah, we do. And then we're bound, aren't we, as we read this, to compare each of us, compare myself to Mary. What have I given to Jesus today or this year or this week or in my whole lifetime, and what Mary did? Would you call what Mary did a good work? I sure would. And that brings us to the topic of good works. I'm going to take a little time out of our account here. It's on the back of your sheet to talk a little bit about good works. And some of this I have on the screen, some of it's on your page, and some of it's on both. But good works, the form of good works always conforms with God's law. Remember that good works are not how we achieve anything toward heaven. That's a gift from God. But with regard to our good works, we're in line, in step with what God has commanded. And often we use 1 John 3:4 here. John says sin is lawlessness, and a good work, therefore, is lawfulness, in complete conformity with God's law. So good works walk in step with the 10 Commandments, right? That's primarily what we're talking about with our good works. How do I show my love for God above all things? How do I show my love for God's name and worship for God? Respect for my parents and authorities. Respect for human life. Respect and love for my spouse. Respect for other people's possessions and for their own good name and reputation. And for their material things, or the living beings in their lives, whether that might happen to be spouse or employees or even animals. I was teaching the 10th commandment last week to our public school catechism kids, and they said, do people really covet animals these days? Do you remember when the last reported incident of cattle rustling was in Minnesota? Do you know? The last one I know of is 2016. So there was a ring in, I believe in Iowa, of guys who would come up, they cross state lines, and come up and grab calves that aren't branded yet or tagged yet, and take them down and tag them or brand them down in Iowa. And the thing about that is, if you're crossing state lines and you exceed a certain amount of money, you've got a double whammy with regard to felony counts. This is a pretty serious crime. But cattle rustling, still a thing. Coveting your neighbor's animals. It's still there. All right, back to what I have here. Good works are a response to the gospel. They are not done to earn anything. And we look at, for example, what God says about good works in what's, I've heard it called Micah's mandate, Micah 6, verse 8. After the Bethlehem Ephrathah passage, this is probably the most famous verse from the prophet Micah in the minor prophets, but he says, he has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So that we often have a sermon that follows the same passage. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. This is actually sometimes an installation text for a teacher or a principal in our fellowship. But following God's law out of love for Christ is one pretty good definition of a good work. We seek the norm of good works from the law, and we reject self-chosen service. There are all kinds of examples in the Bible of people coming up with their own ideas of how they're going to, in their words, show their love or faith to God, and it just blew up in their face. The golden calf, the priests of Baal, Gideon's ephod in the book of Judges, and other things like this, where somebody had this idea. There's no basis for it anywhere in the law, and they think it's going to be what they're going to do, and God's going to think it's wonderful, and it never is. So the law is the perfect rule of good works. People should not think up their new acts of worship, but walk in step with what God has given us. Secondly, only God has the right and authority to establish acts of worship. That's just James 4:12. And finally, the blindness of human reason is deprived of the light of the world. It dwells in sheer darkness. So when we think we have a great idea that God does not command, we should think very carefully about whether we're going to do that or not. Modern examples. I was teaching the sacraments last night in our adult Bible class. And in our Bible information class where new people are coming in, we had quite a few people online and quite a few people in the room. I don't know how many I had last night, but it was quite a group. And the question came up, as it always does, about what some Lutherans call close or closed communion. And I answered very quickly because I've been asked this many times, but I don't like those words, close communion, closed communion. For one thing, they're not scriptural at all, and the church never used them until we were pushed into it. The form of communion that we practice, which is often called close communion, is simply the historic way of doing communion that the church did for 1,500 years. Nobody practiced open communion in the early days of the church, certainly not in the New Testament. Is even Jesus' mother at the Lord's Supper in Matthew 26? Mary, Martha, Lazarus? No, it's just the apostles at that point. Talk about closed communion, but then they're commanded with how to do this and to go out and do it. In the early centuries of the church, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, it's all the same. And even as the church divides and you get different centers for the Christian church, all around the known world at the time, communion was practiced the way that we do it. Whether it was in Palestine, down in Egypt, way over in North Africa, up across the Gibraltar, up in Spain or in Gaul and Italy, France and Britain and so forth, coming back this way over across from Italy would be Albania and I suppose Greece, and then finally into Syria and those little countries north of Syria like Georgia and Armenia and so forth, all practiced communion the way that we do it today. By the year 800, the church is split east and west, but the Greek Orthodox, which includes the Russian Orthodox, still do it the same way as we do today, and the Roman Catholics over in the west did and still do the way that we do it today, as our fellowship only kind of a Lord's Supper. The Lutherans come along, and Luther continues the practice. Absolutely, no change. It's for our membership only. However, at this point, new ideas begin to be formed. Different people begin to have different ideas about the Lord's Supper. Among the Calvinists and the Arminians, there is a change, and the Lord's Supper's value is greatly diminished as words like represents get introduced into communion, where is was always sufficient and is the word Jesus used. And Calvinists and Arminians introduced represents from two different directions. I'm not going to take up all of your time going through all that right now. We might during the Lord's Supper class, though, coming up. In fact, that's just next week, isn't it? But then you have, that continues, however, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. We still have the biblical, historical version of communion that we still use today. It was about 100 years ago, in the 1920s, in the Bay Area of California. So what is that? San Francisco, Oakland is over there. There were two mega churches for their time. The precursors of what we would call the non-denominationals today. By the way, today, the Baptists generally still follow traditional, I'll say closed communion today. But the precursors of the non-denominational movement and also today the Methodists, they created a new thing that they called open communion. Let's make communion open to everybody. Was this a good work? They thought it was. It was a new idea, but contradicts what Paul lays out in Scripture in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 about, do not share this with somebody who is not of our one loaf. And a man ought to examine himself before he partakes of the Lord's Supper and so forth. So that has been a thorn in the side of Christianity now for about a century, which I'm guessing is your whole lifetime. and mine. But when you and I were little, this was still kind of brand new. And even today, it's not that old, and is a problem in the church. But isn't it just like the devil to take a doctrine of the church and flip it on its head? And now, instead of having restrictions around the Lord's Supper, which 1 Corinthians gives us, it opens up the Lord's Supper to anybody. And instead of baptism being open to anybody, the same group has put restrictions around baptism. So inverting the sacraments. And that's just the devil throwing dirt in your eye, because he's a dirty fighter. All right. Let's continue. Now, an important dogmatic question here, though, is, well, what about this act here of Mary anointing Jesus? Is this a good work in that sense? Well, does the law prescribe what Mary did? And the answer is, well, yes. This was partly an outward sign of contrition on her part, and partly an act of kindness and love to treat Jesus with honor in accord with the custom at that time and place. This is how people behave toward each other in that time. So it's not something she's making up. It's something that would be done normally. In fact, everybody would normally have washed the feet of their guests or had their servants do it. And Jesus in one of the Gospels says, Simon, you didn't even wash my feet when I came. This woman is washing them with her tears and with his ointment. She hasn't stopped doing it since I got here. And then also, anointing and washing are listed as works of love and duty owed to a neighbor, Paul says in 1 Timothy 5. So it's in accord also with good works that are laid out in the New Testament. And specifically, this one was done to anoint Jesus for his burial. It wasn't an ordinary act that we would do in the church. I wouldn't expect any of you to anoint, for example, Pastor Scharf before church one day with a bunch of oil, right? But this is something done for Christ before his burial. Clear enough? Have I gone on too long about this? Or just exactly the perfect amount? All right. Thank you, Bev. We'll just go on then. So, then, moving on now to verse 14, one of the 12, one named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests. His name is kind of an odd one. Ishkariot means man from Kerioth. And so the city of Kerioth is down from, it's about 10 miles south of Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem. Hebron is where King David had his capital for the first part of his kingship. So most of the disciples, though, were from where? From Galilee, at least, right? Almost all of them were up. Judas, however, seems to be the only one from down here in Judea. So there's a difference there between Judas and most of the apostles. Even Matthew had his tax collector's booth up in Capernaum. He seems to be a local. So we can prove more than half of them were from up there. I don't know about Simon the Zealot and a couple of others, but Judas certainly was from Judea. Today, this is what Kerioth looks like. You can see it's kind of in a valley. The highway goes through there. You can't see it too well in this picture, but can you see to the right or above the road as it makes its bend to the right, above where it looks like there's dirt there? There's kind of ruins there up on the hill. That's Kerioth. So from above it looks like this. So something you can see a little bit more easily. This is some big structure there at Kerioth, like a temple or something like that. When you're driving by, it looks more like this. So it's one of those don't blink moments because the ruins are not, they haven't been set up. It hasn't been excavated particularly. It's just there. So I don't know what my son is going to do this summer, but Peter's going over to Israel to see some things and maybe do part of a dig with Professor Paustian, but I don't know what they'll be working on. Probably won't be Kerioth, but we'll see. A little bit closer, this thing you can see where some stones at least have been piled up. This isn't really an excavation, it's more like a clearing, but you can see a couple things that are around there. What this doesn't show you is right behind this temple, though, today, which is this. Pretty modern structure. This is a police station. And then in it, next to it, that wall, that's what the tower is. Next to it, though, is a military prep school. So it's for 16 to 18-year-old men. This is their final education before they go to military school, because I believe that, like, just as in the Soviet Union, I believe that in Israel it's compulsory that everybody spends time in the army at a certain time in their life.
Even the women.
Say that again?
Women get drafted also.
I think that's correct. Yeah. Inside this school, though, it looks like a pretty typical school. A lot of books here. This room doubles as a library and a classroom at the same time. This also happens to be one of the chief dividing points between Jordan and Israel, so it's also a crossing station. I think I showed you, it's down near the bottom of the Dead Sea. So it's one of those places where people have to go through gates to get in from one country to the other and so forth. So this is Kerioth, where Judas was evidently born and raised. So Kerioth. So Judas went to the high priests and said, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. Why would Judas have had this idea?
He thought it was going to happen anyway, so why not make money out of it? Because Jesus kept saying he was going to be taken.
Jesus had predicted that he was going to be arrested here. I also wonder about what had happened back in Nazareth, where they tried to grab him and he walked through the crowd, and other times as well, when they tried to trap him and he just escaped with his words. And I wonder if Judas thought, this is the goose that laid the golden egg. I can betray Jesus, he'll wriggle out of it, and I'll have the money. And then I'll do it again. And then I'll do it again. And the problem is, the very first time he ever tried it, Jesus let it happen. He died. And Judas wasn't expecting that. He really expected Jesus to get out of it. But instead, Jesus submits to being arrested and goes on trial and is beaten. And during that time, what does Judas do? You know the story as well as I do. He hangs himself. And we're told in the gospel that the thing broke, and he fell headlong and spilled his blood into this field that they call the field of Akeldama afterwards, which means blood field. And they used it to bury non-residents, I'll say. Gentiles could be buried there. So very tragic story. One of the apostolic fathers also says that Judas was an incredibly fat man. And that's not described in the scriptures, but an early church father says that. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it would explain the falling and so forth. Yeah.
This just occurred to me. Is this maybe one of those reasons why people said when people committed suicide that they were outside the church? Because you're acting in despair, not trusting God? That's what I remember being told.
Sure. Yeah. From this moment, which we saw was probably Wednesday of Holy Week, Judas now looks for an opportunity to betray Jesus. When's the opportunity going to happen?
Thursday night.
Tomorrow night. Yeah, it's not going to be very long. Tomorrow night. By allowing Judas' betrayal, this is at the bottom of your page, even though he knew about it, Jesus was able to make us new again. He didn't tempt Judas to sin. He didn't force Judas to sin. He didn't approve of Judas' sin. But as with our sins, he worked through it and despite it and brought about his plan, even though Judas sinned. Could Jesus have been arrested and everything even if Judas hadn't sinned? Well, it's kind of a moot point because he did, but yeah, sure. But his plan is to rescue us from these very sins. That sounds like it's the whistle, and the clock says it's time to go. God bless you today. I have one more thing to add on the screen, but just with regard to tomorrow, we are no longer going to have the meal, our Lenten meal. Catechism and Wednesday school have already been canceled. We are going to attempt to record the morning, the noon service, so that if you are at work or whatever, you can watch it later, streaming online later in the day if we're not able to have the service later on. But we'll at least have the noon service. Also, I wanted to inform you, it was in the bulletin last week, but I don't know if everybody read it. But I just finished and have had printed my commentary on the book of Acts. It's done to pay for the spines because John Ring charges me by the spine. It's 3 volumes. So it's $40 for the whole, for the set, and I don't sell them separately. I want to sell the whole set in that. But they're available. If you want one, just let me know, or Renee, or whatever, and you can get one. I only had, I have 11 I give away to various libraries, and my 3 godparents, who these are dedicated to. So there are about 40, and I've already sold 5, so there are 35 left. 35 sets. So, and just let me know if you'd like one. You can take one with you today if you can't pay. If certainly you don't have to buy one. And if anybody would like, you can just have the computerized version for free. Okay, that's always a possibility. It's called a PDF file. You can just read the whole thing on your computer screen without having to buy the book if you want. So that's there, and that's free of charge. God bless you all. Weather permitting, we'll see you next Monday. Continue with Lord's Supper. You've been listening to Invisible Church, the Bible study podcast from St. Paul's Lutheran Church, New Ulm, Minnesota.